All right, guys, we're going to be we'll start in Genesis 6 and we'll kind of move over a little bit from there. So go ahead and open up your Bibles if you have one to Genesis 6. And hopefully, as you kind of begun talking about this dynamic between love and power, I know the guys we started getting at, it's really hard to distinguish within the nature and character of God which one is more, which one's most. You know, God is both loving and he is also powerful. And part of why we wanted to focus tonight on the flood story was because it does kind of get this reputation, especially within church circles, of like, we know all the nursery pictures and you've probably done, coloring pages of all the animals. And there's just kind of this like almost like childish way that we look at the story without really understanding the implications of it. One of the better questions that I think we could ask of the flood story is like, why does this happen so early in the Bible? Why do we get this picture of God so early in the Bible? What does the flood story really teach us about the nature and character of God? And if you know what happens outside of the Garden of Eden, really from Genesis 4 through Genesis 11, you start to just see the unraveling of people. It happens first and foremost with these brothers, Cain and Abel, where they both go to worship God. They both present offerings to God. God accepts Abel's offering because it's a pure offering. His whole heart is invested in it, where it seems like Cain probably was going through the motions and just kind of giving God whatever. Cain gets jealous. He gets angry about it. He murders his brother. It's the first murder in human history, the origin of violence between people. But then what you see in Genesis 4 and into Genesis 5 is like the violence escalates. Like things just keep getting worse. And that little picture that we get of people is this like generational increase of wickedness and corruption and people really tearing people apart. And you come into Genesis chapter 6 and you see that things within humanity had gotten so utterly broken, so utterly corrupted, so wicked in all of its ways, so violent in all of its ways, that God speaks this over the people. This is Genesis 6, if you look at in verse 5. And this is that part of the flood story that we don't often teach in like Sunday school stuff, or when you're a little kid, there's nothing on your coloring page that says Genesis 6 verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. There was really nothing inside humanity that was longing to stay connected to God. Everything had become disconnected, kind of like we talked about last week. Every element of relationship with God and within ourselves and within other people and within creation, all of that had been broken. Every intention of the thoughts of the heart were only evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I'll blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. We see this display of power, this recognition that God has the ability, he has the capability of destroying everything that he's created. Now that sounds a little bit like some of the pictures of deities that we get in history books, or maybe even in other religious practices or other expressions. We think, oh yeah, it makes sense that God would have the power to destroy everything that he's created. So why does God have the flood? Well, he's filled with regret and grief over the wickedness and corruption that he sees. And so he realizes that man left to their own devices is not going to choose him. But he found in the midst of these people, Noah and his family, he found a righteous remnant. He found a group of people that were walking with him. And he chooses in that moment to preserve humanity. And with humanity, he chooses to preserve a portion of everything that he's created. And so right there, you begin to see kind of that thread of love pulling through the flood narrative. You'll probably get at some point in your life, if you haven't already, somebody will ask you, how could a loving God do something like the flood? How could he do that? And the answer that we have is, well, the corruption and the violence and the wickedness of people was so bad that all they ever wanted to do was violence and harm to one another. Would you want to live in a world like that? And so what God does is he looks for the people whose hearts are oriented toward him, and he preserves them. And in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, we see that not only was Noah chosen and preserved by God, he also was preaching to the people around him while building the ark. He was proclaiming to people, hey, you're going to want to be a part of this. You're going to want to join us on this boat that we're building. You're going to want to escape the floodwaters that come. And people just thought, no, this dude's crazy. It took a long time to build a boat that big. And then eventually, when it starts raining and everybody starts realizing that what Noah had spoken was true, we begin to see that this new beginning takes place. It's a new origin story. A lot of the things that we see in the story of Noah are very similar to things that we see in the story of the Garden of Eden. It's almost like God has this reset. And he starts with Noah and his family. And then after the flood and after the waters have cleared and after they come out of the boat, it says this in chapter 8, if you'd flip over verse 20, this is where the theme of love really starts to move in. You see both the power and love dynamic at play in the story. It says, chapter 8, verse 20, that Noah, after coming out of the ark, built an altar to the Lord, and he took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intentions of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. If you move over to verse 11, as God was speaking with Noah, he said, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that's with you and for all future generations. That's cool. That's us, guys. Future generations. This promise that God makes all the way back to Noah extends all the way to you and me. This is the promise that he makes. He has set his bow in the cloud. It shall be a sign of the covenant between God and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that's between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When I see the bow is in the clouds, I'll see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature and all flesh that's on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I've established between me and all the flesh that is on the earth. God promises Noah and all the future generations that he's never again going to destroy the earth. He's never again going to remove all living creatures the way he did in the flood. And he creates, or he sets the rainbow in the sky. And I've heard it said, this is the archer's way of kind of retiring his weapon. And he angles the bow in such a way that it's pointing away from the earth. Never again is he going to do that kind of damage to all of the things that he has created. God has all the power to destroy whatever it is that he's created, but he doesn't have the desire to do it. His love, at his core, his loving nature, prompts him to make this promise. And these two things, God's power and God's love, are the bedrock of our faith foundation. We are a people who believe that God is both all-powerful and completely loving. All-powerful and completely loving. He has the ability to destroy everything that he's created, but he does not have the desire to do so. And so when we look even at our man-made institutions, or we look at the way that dynamics of love and power work out in our life, the reason that we want to see both love and power each and every day is because that's reflective of the nature and character of God. The flood story is not a story about animals walking 2 by 2 into a mobile zoo. The flood story is about showing the people who would come to read and know the story both the love and power of the God who is all-powerful and all-loving. And so what we're going to do here now is we're just going to go back into our groups, and we're going to talk a little bit about how this kind of nursery rhyme or kind of artwork-oriented kind of flood story became kind of the main thing. And we're going to talk instead now about how does your view of the flood story start to mature? How do you start to better understand the nature and character of God, his loving nature and his powerful nature in light of this story? And we'll talk about any questions or such that we have on the flood story. Sound good? All right, let's go back to our groups.